Here we are yet again clamoring on about the debt ceiling, the showdown between Democrats and Republicans on who can give the least ground. One side wanting spending cuts, while the Treasury is noting they have currently only received a little over half of the expected tax collections from 2022. Meanwhile, big money is placing one of the biggest bets ever on the value of treasuries dropping, and the cost of insuring against the United States defaulting on its debt is currently higher than it's been since 2011. But I'm going to show you why all of this is just noise, whether the debt ceiling is raised or whether it is not raised, whether inflation or deflation takes off, whether rates stay the same, go up or go down. It is all distraction from the reality that a default is inevitable, a reality that the United States can simply not escape. So what is a default? Because we have to understand very clearly what a default is first if we're going to make the claim that it's inevitable. There are two types of defaults, but in general, it just means you do not deliver on your promise to repay what you borrow. Now, in order to understand what I'm about to illustrate, let's use pizza as an example. If I borrow from you one slice of pizza and I tell you, hey, I'm going to pay you back with a slice of pizza, would you be upset if tomorrow when I go to repay you that slice of pizza, I repay you with a slice of pizza that is half the size of the one that I borrowed from you? You would rightly realize that I did not actually deliver on my promise. I gave you back less pizza than what I borrowed. Even though it's still one slice, I gave you back less than what I took. Now, maybe the reason that I did this is because I didn't have a full slice available to give to you. So my other option would have just been to knock on your door and say, sorry, I can't give you any pizza at all. Either way though, I am defaulting. I am not delivering on my obligation to give you back exactly what I borrowed from you. And so that illustrates the two types of defaults that are available. There's an outright default or a technical default. An outright default is where I simply just do not give back to you the number of things that I promised to give to you. In this case, it would be dollars. The second option is a technical default, meaning I do give you back the number of dollars that I promised to give you back, but they can't purchase the same amount of stuff as they could when I originally borrowed them from you. Now let's go through a few hypothetical futures and see why every single potential outcome results in either a technical default or an outright default. The first situation is the debt ceiling situation we have right now. Right now, legislation is trying to work its way through Congress in order to raise the debt ceiling, with both sides not wanting to give up any ground. So option number one, while it is extremely unlikely, is that because of this political friction, they're not able to get something passed in the United States because of this law defaults and cannot raise new debt in order to pay off its old debt. This would be an example of an outright default. Now, the odds of this happening are low, but they're not zero. This is why Yellen has spoken to Congress recently again saying this would be an economic catastrophe. And this is why the cost of insuring yourself against the United States defaulting on its debt has risen to a new high. But let's dismiss that situation and move on to the next potential future where they do raise the debt ceiling and they're able to borrow new money in order to pay off the old money. We are then faced with two potential futures, economically speaking, one in which we have deflation and one in which we have inflation. So let's discuss deflation first. There are quite a few things happening right now that are leading us towards a deflationary near-term future. Number one, credit crunch. Number two, shipping dropping off of a cliff. Number three, unemployment. Number four, layoffs. Number five, interest rates skyrocketing and people not being able to afford their debt. All these things mean income and money dries up from the system. That's a deflationary outcome. This is why tax levels right now are 35% lower than forecast. And so far, the Treasury has only received a little over half of the expected tax dollars. There's less money floating around in the system. Asset prices are not as high. There's not as much income. There are not as many sales. So there's a lot less money flowing into the Treasury's coffers right now. When the federal government gets less money from taxes, they have to borrow even more in order to pay off their old debt and fund their new expenses. As they borrow more, that means interest rates rise even further. As those interest rates rise, it means the government's cost of borrowing goes up for every extra dollar they have to borrow. This is a process that maybe it takes a few years, maybe it takes less, but eventually they can't borrow enough in order to pay off their old debt because they can't afford the interest rate on their new debt. This deflationary outcome leads to an outright default. But let's be honest, it'll probably never get to that either. We'll probably see a short-term deflationary outcome here. We'll see tax receipts drop off a cliff. We'll see borrowing rates for the United States government go up. But we're probably not going to get to the point where that alone would cause the government to default. And that's because of this man right here. It'll most likely get to the point where the federal government's increased cost of borrowing makes life so difficult that the economy has major problems. And then this guy makes this number go down. Essentially, the Federal Reserve prints a bunch of money and lends it to the United States government to help interest rates come down to decrease borrowing costs for the government. This is an inflationary outcome because that means now the government's spending is financed through new money being printed. And we know that when new money gets printed, it only has purchasing power as much as it can take away from the previously existing money. So when they print money in order to pay off their old debt, it's like giving you back a half a slice of pizza and just saying, well, it's still a slice. It's not an outright default, but it is a technical default. And this is why hedge funds right now have the biggest bet ever against US Treasuries. They have literally created the largest ever short position on benchmark Treasuries, even surpassing the steep short in 2019. Because if we get the deflationary outcome, then government borrowing costs go up. That means Treasury values go down because the government has to borrow more and more and more in order to finance its lack of taxes coming in. But if we get the inflationary outcome, then the Federal Reserve has to keep on fighting inflation, and they have to keep on raising rates, and they have to keep on selling assets off their balance sheet, which also raises rates. This might very well turn out to be a very profitable trade for hedge funds, but it's not the only thing people are doing. Investors have also started using credit default swaps in order to be insured against the United States default. But that as well is probably not something that most people are going to be able to do themselves. And it also still has counterparty risk, meaning if the United States defaults, you still have to rely on those credit default swaps paying out in order to cover your losses, which is a big if. For instance, car insurance is there to protect you, your financial liability, if you get into a car accident. But imagine every single person who has Geico car insurance gets into a car accident on the exact same day. Geico goes under. They don't have the funds to be able to bail all of the drivers out at once. So if the United States defaults, then what are the chances that all those credit default swaps are able to pay out? This is why investors, big money even, like central banks, they're buying gold. People are buying Bitcoin because it's a credit default swap. If the Treasury fails, then the dollar will be worth a lot less, which means things like gold and Bitcoin will be worth a lot more. And there's no counterparty risk with those. You don't have to worry about somebody on the other side paying you out. I've got affiliate links for all of my favorite Bitcoin and gold companies linked in the description below. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.